Tanya Johnson, a 41-year-old federal prosecutor, had just returned from a week-long conference in London about financial crimes. She was eager to return home to New York after a long week of intense discussions on legal reforms. As she stepped through customs at JFK Airport, her presence was nothing short of confident. She was a woman of success, dressed in a well-tailored suit, carrying a Louis Vuitton handbag that reflected her hard-earned achievements. However, today would be different. As Tanya made her way through the airport, Detective Frank Miller and Officer James Brooks, both in their 40s, stood near baggage claim, idly scanning the crowd. They had seen many faces in their years of service, but today something caught their attention. A call had just come in over their radios. The report was vague, almost nonsensical. Suspicious woman, black, wearing expensive attire, might be involved in illicit activity. The description was limited. No name, no further details. Yet for Frank and James, that was all they needed. It wasn't the first time they'd been conditioned to believe that success, especially when worn by a black woman, could be a cover for something illegal. Frank glanced at James, who nodded, and the two quickly began walking toward Tanya. They had made up their minds before even speaking to her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can you stop for a moment?" Frank's voice was authoritative, but polite. Tanya, sensing something was wrong, paused and turned toward the two officers. She had been in the legal world long enough to know the feeling of being treated differently because of her race, but never before had she encountered such blatant profiling. Tanya met their gaze without flinching. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "We need to see some identification," James said, his tone flat. Tanya raised an eyebrow. "Why? I've just cleared customs." Frank crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes as he took in Tanya's luxurious suit and handbag. "We've received a report about a suspicious woman matching your description. We need to verify your identity." "And what description would that be?" Tanya asked, her patience starting to wear thin. "Just need to verify, ma'am. It's routine," Frank responded, his eyes still lingering on her expensive attire. Tanya felt the weight of the moment settle on her. She wasn't unfamiliar with the type of prejudice that fueled this kind of treatment, but she was determined to stand her ground. "I'm a federal prosecutor," she said coolly, producing her passport from her bag. Frank glanced at the passport cover without opening it. He handed it to James, who barely skimmed the pages. "American citizen?" Frank asked almost skeptically. Tanya nodded, her calm demeanor still unwavering. "Yes, as my passport clearly states," James snorted. "What were you doing in London?" "Business," Tanya replied, not flinching at his tone. "Business in what field?" James asked, a hint of mockery creeping into his voice. "Law," Tanya replied succinctly. Frank raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you do in law?" "I'm a federal prosecutor," Tanya said, emphasizing each word. She could see their doubt, could feel the disbelief in their eyes, but she stood firm. James let out a half laugh. "A federal prosecutor? Really? And you're being profiled?" Tanya remained composed. "If you don't believe me, check my details in your system." Instead of following up, Frank shook his head. "We believe you might be carrying contraband or using a fake identity. We'll need to investigate further." Tanya's blood began to boil, but she kept her voice level. "What evidence do you have for that? You have no right to hold me without cause." James shrugged, clearly uninterested in her rights. "We're just doing our job." Tanya's mind raced. She had heard that excuse too many times. Just doing our job used to cover up abuses of power. "Unless you have a valid reason to hold me," she said, her voice ice cold, "I am free to go." Before she could take a step, Frank grabbed her arm firmly. "No, you're not." Tanya's body tensed, but she stayed calm. "What are you doing?" she demanded. James reached for his belt, pulling out handcuffs. "You're being detained for further investigation." The moment her wrists were bound, Tanya realized the true nature of what was happening. She was being detained for no reason other than her race and her success. The officers had made a grave mistake. Tanya was led through the terminal, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. She could feel the eyes of the surrounding passengers on her. Some curious, some confused, others pulling out their phones to record the scene. A quiet tension filled the air as the two officers marched her toward a small security room in the back of the airport. As they walked, Tanya kept her expression neutral, even though a storm of anger and frustration brewed inside her. She had been through countless high-stakes situations in her career, but never had she imagined being the one on the receiving end of this kind of humiliation. Once inside the small, sterile interrogation room, Frank and James motioned for her to sit at a metal table. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a cold, clinical glow over everything. Tanya sat down, her back straight, her eyes locked on the officers. James uncuffed her roughly, the sound of the metal clicking echoing in the silent room. He didn't seem to care about her discomfort. In fact, he seemed almost pleased by it. He was used to wielding his power in situations like this, and for him, Tanya was just another person to control. "Sit tight," James said, his tone dismissive. "We'll need to confirm your story." Tanya didn't flinch, but the words cut through her. She knew the drill. This wasn't a simple security check. The officers weren't interested in verifying her identity. They were interested in breaking her, forcing her into a corner and watching her react. "I want to make a phone call," Tanya said evenly. Frank let out a short laugh, clearly amused by the request. "Oh, really? You think just because you say you're a federal prosecutor, we're going to let you call whoever you want?" Tanya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with controlled fury. "It's my right to call the federal prosecutor's office. I demand it." Frank chuckled, stepping closer to her, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Demand all you want. You're not calling anyone until we're done here. You're the one under suspicion, not us." She stared at him for a long moment. "You know, this could all be cleared up in a few seconds if you just check my details properly. You have the access." But Frank didn't seem interested in verifying anything. He was too caught up in his own version of the truth, the one where Tanya, successful, confident, and black, was somehow the anomaly. Tanya stayed calm, but inside she was seething. She had fought her entire career to break down barriers, to prove that people like her belonged in spaces of power and influence. And yet, here she was, treated like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin. Minutes passed and Tanya's patience began to wear thin. The room was silent except for the sound of Frank flipping through the papers in front of him. He looked up, his eyes flashing with suspicion. "So, a federal prosecutor, huh? That's a real nice story, but I still don't buy it." Tanya's lips curled into a thin smile. She had encountered this kind of doubt before in her career. There had always been someone who didn't believe in her, who questioned her right to be in the room, to hold the title she had earned. "You can doubt me all you want," Tanya said coolly, "but you're wasting both your time and mine. I have a case to get back to." James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. "You think you're too important to be here? Just because you wear that fancy suit doesn't mean you get to walk all over us." Tanya didn't flinch. "I'm not here because I think I'm too important. I'm here because I've worked my ass off to get to this point, and I won't let you or anyone else make me feel less than what I am." Frank let out an exasperated sigh. "This is going nowhere. I'm going to check the system, but you better hope you're telling the truth." As Frank turned to leave, Tanya sat still, her mind racing. She could feel the tension building in the room, the unfairness of the situation pressing down on her like a weight. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let these officers or anyone else define who she was. Frank returned a few moments later, a puzzled look on his face. He handed Tanya a piece of paper from the computer system. The printout confirmed what she had already said. Tanya Johnson was indeed a federal prosecutor. There was no doubt about her identity. Frank's expression shifted from arrogance to guilt, but it was too late. Tanya knew the damage had already been done. "I want to file a complaint," she said, her voice low but steady. Frank tried to mask his discomfort with a shrug. "You can do whatever you want. Doesn't change the fact that we had reason to question you." "Reason?" Tanya's voice was hard now, as the weight of the situation became clear. "Your reason was nothing but prejudice." The minutes dragged on in the cold, sterile interrogation room. Tanya sat there staring ahead, her mind racing through everything that had happened so far. The handcuffs had been removed, but she could still feel the tightness of the cuffs around her wrists, as if they were an indelible mark of the injustice she was experiencing. The officers were treating her like a criminal, But Tanya knew she was anything but. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, yet here she was, being unjustly detained for no reason other than the color of her skin and her success. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door to the small room opened. Tanya's gaze flicked toward the entrance, and in walked a new officer, a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed uniform, his demeanor more professional than Frank and James's. His eyes widened when he saw Tanya, and for a brief moment, his expression faltered, as if he knew something was off. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp with authority. Frank and James both froze, not expecting anyone to intervene. The new officer, whose name was Sergeant Adam Phillips, looked at the two officers, his gaze flicking back and forth between them and Tanya. Tanya's eyes met his, her expression impassive, but her frustration was palpable. She was exhausted, but she wasn't about to let this slide. "I demand to know why I'm being detained," Tanya said, her voice steady despite the surge of anger rising within her. Sergeant Phillips glanced at the paperwork Frank had been reviewing. His eyes moved quickly over the printout and then back to Tanya. Are you a federal prosecutor?" he asked, his voice now tinged with surprise. Tanya nodded slowly, her jaw clenched. "Yes, I am, and I expect you to verify my identity immediately." The sergeant's eyes widened, and he took a step back, clearly shaken by the realization that he was dealing with someone of considerable importance. Frank and James, on the other hand, stood there, unsure of how to react. Their faces were filled with a mix of embarrassment and guilt, but they weren't about to admit they had been wrong. "I'll check the system again," Sergeant Phillips said, his voice now filled with urgency. He pulled out his phone, making a quick call to the command center. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity, the silence in the room oppressive as Tanya waited for confirmation. Finally, Phillips hung up and turned toward her, his face grim. "It's true," he said softly. "You're Tanya Johnson, a federal prosecutor. I'm so sorry for this." The weight of the apology didn't lessen the sting of the humiliation Tanya had already endured. She had spent years fighting for fairness in a system that often seemed stacked against people like her, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment, being treated like a criminal in her own country. "Sorry?" Tanya echoed, her voice hard. "Sorry doesn't undo what's already been done." Sergeant Phillips was silent for a moment, clearly at a loss for words. Frank and James stood off to the side, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to step forward and take responsibility for their actions. "This is a serious matter," Tanya said, her voice low and dangerous. "You can't just treat people this way because you think they look suspicious. You need to be held accountable for what's happened here." Sergeant Phillips seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. He turned to Frank and James, his face tight with anger. "You two made a big mistake," he said sharply. "You can't just stop someone and treat them like this without proper cause, and certainly not someone of her stature." Frank opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. James stood there, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet Tanya's eyes. He knew they had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. "I'll report this," Phillips said, his voice firm. "This will be investigated, and you both will be held accountable." Tanya didn't respond. She had heard enough excuses. She had spent too many years in the legal world to tolerate this kind of behavior. If she allowed it to go unchallenged, it would happen again, both to her and to others. Sergeant Phillips turned back to Tanya. "You should be free to go now, Ms. Johnson. I'll ensure that this incident is fully investigated. You deserve an apology, but I know it doesn't fix what you've been through." Tanya nodded, her posture still rigid, her pride intact. "An apology isn't enough," she said coldly. "But for now, I'll accept it. But make no mistake, this is far from over." As Tanya stood and walked toward the door, her eyes stayed fixed on Frank and James. She knew the damage was already done, but she wouldn't let them forget what had happened. She wasn't just walking away from this situation, she was going to fight back. She would make sure that these officers, and the system that enabled them, would be held accountable for the way they treated her and countless others like her. The next few hours felt like a whirlwind for Tanya. After leaving the interrogation room, she was escorted out of the airport with her head held high. But inside, the sting of the ordeal still burned. It wasn't just about the mistreatment she'd endured. It was the realization that, Despite her position in the legal system, she had been reduced to a mere suspect, targeted solely because of her race and her success. The officers had not seen her as a person, but as a stereotype. As she walked through the crowded terminal toward the exit, her phone buzzed incessantly. Tanya's hands shook as she picked it up. It was a flood of texts and missed calls. Friends, colleagues, and surprisingly, even strangers. The story had broken on social media almost immediately after the incident, the videos of her being detained and handcuffed spreading like wildfire. In the span of just a few hours, Tanya's face had become a symbol of racial injustice and police abuse of power. The posts were relentless, with hashtags like #Justice for Tanya, #racial profiling, and #abuse of power trending across platforms. News outlets were picking up the story, with anchors calling it a blatant example of racism in law enforcement. Tanya, the federal prosecutor, who had spent years putting away corrupt officials and powerful criminals, was now the victim of the same kind of system she had once fought so hard to uphold. By the time Tanya reached her car, she was already overwhelmed. Her thoughts were racing, and she felt a deep pit of exhaustion settling in her stomach. She needed to clear her mind, but there was no time for that. She couldn't let this incident be swept under the rug. She couldn't let Frank and James, those two officers, get away with what they had done. She sat in her car for a long while looking at the sea of messages on her phone. Tanya knew that she couldn't ignore the call for justice. She had spent her entire career fighting for fairness and equality, but now her fight had come to her doorstep. That evening, Tanya drafted a statement, one that would be released to the public. It wasn't just a plea for sympathy, it was a call for action. She knew that the only way to bring about real change was to make sure this wasn't just another isolated incident. She had to hold the officers accountable, and she had to make sure this was a turning point for the system as a whole. By the next morning, Tanya had already contacted her legal team. A lawsuit was in the works, one that would accuse Frank and James of racial discrimination, abuse of power, and violation of her civil rights. She knew the legal system could be slow and frustrating, but if there was any hope of real change, she had to take the fight to court. As news of the lawsuit spread, public outrage grew. Small protests began in New York, calling for police reform and an end to racial profiling. People were angry, rightfully so. Tanya had become a symbol not just of an individual wrong, but of a much larger systemic issue that plagued the justice system. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted. In the days that followed, Tanya was contacted by several media outlets, eager to hear her side of the story. They wanted to know how someone like her, a person of authority, a federal prosecutor, could be subjected to such blatant racial profiling. The public was demanding answers, and Tanya knew that she had to speak out. She did a series of interviews, sharing her experience and speaking passionately about the need for accountability and reform in law enforcement. She wasn't afraid to name names. Tanya made it clear that Frank and James weren't just two bad apples in the system. They were representative of a much deeper problem. She called on the justice system to take responsibility, not only for her case, but for the countless others who had been mistreated and overlooked. The media storm was intense. Tanya's words resonated with people all over the country. The video footage from the airport, showing Tanya being handcuffed and treated like a criminal, became a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar injustices. Soon, the #, Justice for Tanya, was everywhere, and calls for police reform grew louder by the day. Tanya, however, remained focused. While the public outcry and media attention were important, she knew that the real battle would be fought in the courtroom. She was determined to see Frank and James held accountable for their actions, and she was ready to go the distance. Her legal team was already working around the clock to build the case, gathering evidence and preparing for what was sure to be a long and complicated trial. Tanya had no illusions about the fight ahead, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to back down. As the days passed, the pressure on the police department mounted. Officials began to feel the weight of the public's anger, and they knew that they couldn't ignore this situation for long. There would be consequences, and those consequences, Tanya promised herself, would not just affect Frank and James. They would send a message to the entire justice system that racism and abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. The days following Tanya's announcement of the lawsuit were filled with intense media coverage, public scrutiny, and mounting pressure on law enforcement. It seemed like the entire nation was watching, eager for justice. The video of Tanya being handcuffed at JFK Airport had gone viral, and the images of a successful, confident black woman being treated like a criminal sparked outrage. But it wasn't just the viral video that made waves. It was Tanya's refusal to let the incident be swept under the rug, her insistence that accountability and change were the only ways forward. As the trial date approached, the pressure on the New York Police Department and the officers involved, Frank Miller and James Brooks, intensified. Tanya's legal team had meticulously gathered evidence, and every aspect of the case was being scrutinized. The courtroom became the stage for a battle not only for Tanya's personal justice, but for a larger fight against the systemic racism and abuse of power within law enforcement. On the first day of the trial, the courthouse was packed with journalists, supporters, and onlookers. News outlets from across the country had descended upon the courthouse to cover the trial, with some even broadcasting it live. Tanya, calm and composed, entered the courtroom, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. As a federal prosecutor, she had spent years in courtrooms, but today the stakes were higher than ever. The defense team for Frank and James tried to argue that the officers were simply doing their job, that their actions were based on a reasonable suspicion that Tanya was involved in some illegal activity. But Tanya's legal team quickly dismantled their argument. They presented the video evidence showing the officers stopping Tanya without cause, questioning her without any reasonable suspicion, and treating her with disdain simply because of her race. Witnesses who had been in the airport that day took the stand. One by one, they shared their accounts of the incident, their voices filled with outrage and empathy. A middle-aged white woman who had been recording the video broke down in tears as she recalled seeing Tanya handcuffed. "She didn't deserve this," the woman said through her tears. "She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just walking through the airport like the rest of us." Another witness, a businessman who had also witnessed the events, testified, "I saw how they treated her. It was clear to me they were targeting her because of the way she looked. If she had been a white woman, none of this would have happened." With each testimony, the defense's case weakened. Tanya's legal team made it clear that this wasn't just about two rogue officers. It was about a larger problem within the system. Their argument wasn't just about racial profiling. It was about the abuse of power and the discrimination that was rampant within law enforcement institutions. This was about making sure that what happened to Tanya never happened again. After days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty. Frank Miller and James Brooks were found guilty of racial discrimination and abuse of power. The room erupted in tension, but for Tanya, the weight of the moment was heavy, not because of her personal victory, but because of the message it sent. The officers were sentenced to prison for their actions, but that was just the beginning. The case set a precedent, and soon other departments across the country were forced to reckon with the systemic racism that had been allowed to persist within law enforcement. Tanya's fight for justice had sparked a movement, and the ripple effects were felt in every corner of society. When Tanya stepped outside the courthouse to face the crowd of reporters, cameras flashing in every direction, she didn't speak to the victory alone. Instead, she spoke about the change she hoped to see. "This victory isn't just mine," Tanya said, her voice steady and clear. "It's for everyone who's been treated unfairly. It's for those whose voices have been silenced. It's for every person who has ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted in applause as Tanya walked away from the courthouse, her head held high. The officers who had humiliated her were now the ones facing the consequences of their actions. Tanya had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been subjected to injustice. The ultimate lesson is clear. We all have a responsibility to fight against injustice, to ensure that fairness is not just a privilege for a few, but a right for everyone. Change is possible, but it requires action, and Tanya Johnson's story is proof that one voice can make a difference.